At the heart of humanity, of our human nature, is this desire to cooperate, to partner, to work together, this desire for community. We talk about companies, we talk about organizations, and those names themselves imply that people are together. And most of us believe that we can do more together than we can alone. So if you accept this idea that part of human nature is this desire to cooperate and collaborate and work in team, you probably also realize that another part of human nature is conflict. And somehow these two things, these two aspects of human nature, they collide. And it's unavoidable. And so while many of us have lived the dream of this cooperation, often our lived experience is full of conflict, discouragement, things that could have been that weren't because conflict entered the picture. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about workplace conflict, about my own journey, in a sense, of going through conflict time and time again, to the point where people started inviting me to talk about conflict, and here I am. One of the foremost minds in this area of conflict management, one of the early pioneers, was a man named Dr. Daniel Dana. And he made this statement. He said, unmanaged conflict is the largest reducible cost in organizations today. The largest reducible cost in organizations today, yet it is also the least recognized. Well, let's take a look at some of those costs. There's lots of research being done about conflict. One of the interesting one was about 12 years ago. They tried to estimate what the costs of conflict are in the United States alone. And they came in with what they considered a very low or conservative estimate of around $359 billion a year is wasted because of workplace conflict. Now, this conflict shows itself in many ways. One of the biggest ways is loss of time. Time that could be spent productively is spent dealing with conflict. The idea of restructuring, and it's when you, instead of dealing directly with a conflict, you reorganize your organization so you can go around the conflict. The idea of the reduced quality of decision making because people that need to be working together aren't, and information isn't getting shared. Lower job motivation, sabotage, theft, loss of skilled employees, and the cost of rehiring and retraining and that getting in that cycle. And then last but not least are the health costs. Johanna a little bit earlier talked about the stress and the amount of stress that's in the workplace today. Well, two things, the two greatest contributors to stress are the workload and conflict. And these are things that take a stress and make a stress exponentially more hard. And so stress and burnout are often driven by conflict and workload. A survey that surveyed more than 5,000 employees in 9 different countries came up with this. Your average employee, your employee who doesn't have anybody to supervise, they say they spend at least 2 hours a day, 2 hours a week dealing with conflict. Managers spend 20% of their time, or 9 hours a week, dealing with conflict. And these are conservative efforts. I know in my own work life, I sometimes spent 40 hours a week dealing with a conflict when it took over. Hopefully that's not our normal experience. And then 1 in 3 managers feel like they deal with conflict well. So their own self-reflection is that they don't think they deal with conflict well. And 1 out of 3 thinks they do. And I think that 1 is probably misinformed. But with all this research that's going on, and it's really readily available on the internet, you'd think that we'd be making progress in dealing with conflict. You know, we have the millennials coming up, and you know, the millennials are very relational, and we have these great universities throughout Europe. But you know, there's not one university, as far as I know, and I've done quite a lot of research, and I've asked quite a lot of people. There's not one university that where they have the business school, the marketing school, the management school, the school of economics. There's not one that trains their managers on how to deal with conflict. And if a university has a conflict management course, it's probably in the psychology department, and people in the business school never get over there. And so what we have in our situation today is people dealing with conflict the way they feel best. And the Nordic School of Management is trying to do something about that. One way to look at, I love the iceberg metaphor. You can use it for almost everything. But one way of looking at conflict is that conflict is like an iceberg. That is the formal aspects of conflict. That when it comes up and becomes like a wrongful dismissal or a serious type of conflict, when it gets documented, then it becomes formal. And that's just probably, 15% of the actual conflict that's going on. The vast majority of conflict is going on under the surface, unseen by most people in line management, until it ruptures. And they say that about 80 to 90% of the conflict that becomes formal conflict, if it was handled in a different stage, it would have never become a formal conflict. And if we can focus on dealing with informal conflict, we can save a lot of money. We can have happier staff. The United Nations, which has a tremendously detailed policy in HR, they have nothing going on in this area of informal conflict. Now, one way to look at conflict is this conflict spectrum. And I like this. I find it very helpful. So on one side you have the escape responses, and the other side you have attack responses. Escape responses, the extreme expression of an escape response is suicide. The extreme response of an attack, the attack response is murder. So you get this? And you have different types of characteristics like flight or running away, blaming, denial. Those are characteristically escape responses. And characteristic attack responses, verbal assault, hostile litigation, sabotage, violence. And we have these two extremes. And what we want to do is work on developing what we call the management responses, those responses in the middle. Now, interesting enough, our personalities tend to cause us to lean towards either we tend to either escape or we tend to attack. Like your personality, you have a tendency. Your natural response would be either to escape or to attack. And then you have your national culture or your ethnic culture, which is another layer. And so in Sweden, what do you think the prevailing notion or prevailing behavior in conflict? Is it to escape or to attack? It's escape. It's the tendency. And we're going to talk about culture, but the definition of culture is what's expected, reinforced, and rewarded within a group. So in a sense, our Swedish culture encourages and reinforces escape responses. What about a culture that's more an attack culture? How about Russia? I've been there. I've been in taxi cabs. They're scary sometimes. I mean, there's just this sense of they tend to attack before they would escape. It's just the bent, and it's reinforced. So you not only have your own personality and then the national culture that are working through that, then we also have the organizational culture. And this is what we want to talk about, is laying down an organizational culture that is in this middle, this what we call manageable responses. And to do that, we need to build it. And here's what we're working at in the Nordic School of Management, and how we want to work on helping develop conflict resolution strategies or a conflict resolution culture within your organization. And that has to do with following what's sometimes called the employment cycle. And the employment cycle basically has 3 phases that repeat themselves. But you have the onboarding, which is the hiring and the orientation part. And then you have your step 2, the performance and development. That's when you're trained and you're doing your job. And then we have the transition period. And transition period is either when you leave your job, which, as statistics say, most millennials will be leaving the job every 2 or 3 years, transitioning out. But transitioning is also that part where you go from a job where you're a worker bee to being a manager. Like almost all careers, you start as an engineer, you're a great engineer, and then after a while, you're promoted to be a manager of engineers, and you don't do so much engineering anymore. And that can be true with the teaching profession, practically any profession. There's this progression which leads you into management and supervising, and there you need another level of training. Now, here's my little string. Let me illustrate it like this, simply. So, if you want to build this into your culture, well, you start with your job interview. You ask about conflict resolution. So that's a point. Another point would be when you call up the potential employees' references. You ask them, how did that person do in conflict resolution? Then you have your orientation, and you explain your company's values, and you speak into that with what the expectations are with conflict resolution. And then you enter into this next stage, and it might be another type of training. It might be your annual performance review, where you talk about how it's going with conflict. But the idea behind this is that throughout the organization's employment cycle, that there are different points of intervention where conflict is talked about, because culture is what's expected, reinforced, and rewarded. And so you have to build that into your culture in order to get the results of having conflict resolved rather than just built up. Well-managed conflicts consistently produce win-win situations. Win situations for the staff and win situations for the company. Thank you.